planet's biodiversity is in crisis. According to WWF's Living Planet report, wild vertebrate populations have declined by 73% over the last 50 years. Species are disappearing faster than ever, and yet those with the deepest connections to the land, like indigenous and local communities, are often pushed aside. Conservation has historically relied on Western scientific approaches, which has perpetually sidelined traditional ecological knowledge. Ironically, those excluded have been the strongest protectors of biodiversity. In Canada, Indigenous nations receive just 1% of charitable funds. Globally, grassroots conservation efforts get only a tiny slice of total financing. So, who gets to decide what to protect? How do we ensure more voices shape conservation? And why does that matter? I'm Sam Burgh, a Master of Environmental Science student at University of Toronto Scarborough, and this is Diversity Defended. Along with my co-producers, Gigi, Alsaadi, and Dina, we explore equity and inclusivity in conservation through 4 conversations with Maggie Chang, Asana Farshchi, Professor Thomas Hummel, and Professor Christian Abizaid. We'll dive into diversity in conservation and its growing challenges, the value of community-based efforts, and Indigenous and local leadership in protecting ecosystems. Let's begin. Our first guest is Professor Christian Abizaid, a U of T professor who has spent over 2 decades researching communities in the Peruvian Amazon.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you about this important issue. So my name is Christian Abizaid. I am a professor with a cross appointment between the Department of Geography and the School of the Environment. I'm originally from Mexico, but for more than 20 years now, I've been conducting research in the Peruvian Amazon, working with indigenous and local communities, trying to understand their livelihoods in relation to conservation, development, environmental change adaptation. And it is within the context of the work that I do that I thought of how to engage with this topic for today.
Thank you, Professor. My first question would be, what is your own understanding of equitable and inclusive conservation? And I'm really interested in your perspective as someone who's been in this field for such a long time.
So thank you. Yeah, so I guess my answer is going to be framed within the context of the work that I do and the people that I work with. So just to provide a little bit more context, I have worked with indigenous communities and with other local rural communities that don't self-identify as indigenous, but who face many of the same challenges that indigenous peoples in Latin America face. And I want to highlight 3 of them because I think they're important for this issue. I think one of the most important ones is that they are and continue to be, to a large extent, invisible to the outside world. Things are beginning to change, but what we see, or the degree to which we see them and how we see them and conceive them, remains very limited. Second of all, in relation to, I guess, environmental change and conservation, they are amongst those that are most affected by conservation policies or the impacts of climate and environmental change. And the other, which has been an important inspiration for the work that I do, is that I think that they can provide us with important lessons on how we can connect with nature, the environment, and so on. Not perhaps in the simplistic and conventional ways that we often think, but I think provide different perspectives that provide food of thought and alternative ways of doing things and connecting with the world around us. So back to the issue of equitability and inclusivity, I think for me, conservation that is equitable and inclusive is one that takes into account indigenous peoples and locals communities, one that pays attention to their knowledge, to their perspectives, as well as to, whether things work for them or not, which I think makes me connect to a larger issue that I think we still have to figure out in the conservation agenda at multiple levels, right? And one is about how we define conservation. So what is to be conserved? Is it just, the beautiful birds, or the panda bears or the polar bears, or is it something greater, right? Or ecosystems, right? So what are we conserving? Who are we conserving for, right? Or for what, right? And also about the different ways in which we can achieve conservation and the role that humans play in that relation to nature when thinking about conservation. Are we exogenous to or separated from nature, or can we function and live well within nature? And I think to connect a little bit more, I think one of the things that has happened historically, and I think continues to happen, is that Indigenous peoples and also local communities are either ignored, often they're vilified or blamed, or they're romanticized, which also poses certain challenges. So we tend to see it as a dichotomy between black and white, good and bad. And this is where understanding how people relate to nature, how they use resources, how they relate to nature in multiple and complex ways, I think can be really, really instrumental.
I feel so mind blown by all the insights that you shared right now. And so my other question would be actually, is there anything else you'd like to share about, let's say, what are the advantages or disadvantages about making conservation decisions much more inclusive?
Okay, maybe I'll start with some of the challenges. And I alluded to one of them already, right? One is that we know very little still about how Indigenous peoples and local communities use nature and resources found within nature, but how they also relate with nature in more complex ways. We're just beginning to understand it. And there are, I think, some cultural and epistemological, ontological barriers to really fully grasping that. The second challenge, and this I think is important still today, when I guess there is a greater interest in learning more so about Indigenous peoples than other local communities. So I think one would be to be able also not to shed a very narrow net into what we consider to be Indigenous and valid, but also to include other local communities. I just want to maybe mention quickly an example. One of the groups that I have worked with most in the Peruvian Amazon is a group that does not self-identify as Indigenous, but is a group that is conformed of people that have very strong Indigenous backgrounds. They have a deep historical and place-based connection with their surrounding, deep environmental knowledge, but just because they don't claim that identity of Indigenous, they are even more invisible than those groups that have self-identify as Indigenous and that have become much more politicized and mobilize their identity to, I guess, in their struggles for recognition and their rights, their struggles for rights.
Absolutely, really agree with all you just said. And just to move on to our last question, I was wondering if you could perhaps share a little bit more about your experiences working with Indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon. I find this really fascinating, and I would love to hear if you have some examples, perhaps personal anecdotes or experiences that you had.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And here maybe I'm going to divert a little bit. It's still connected, I think, with the issues around conservation, but I'm going to go a little bit on a tangent, but connecting it to the issue of the invisibility of Indigenous peoples and local communities in relation to some of the work that I've been doing. So again, I work in the Peruvian Amazon. I work in riverine communities found within the floodplain, where people have a long history of living, but also and connecting, but also using resources in an environment that is that seasonally fluctuates between water and land, right? It's a setting that to many us outsiders would seem incredibly challenging, right? Because people build their houses up on stilts. They farm within the floodplain, they fish, they use resources from the forest. There's no roads. They use the river as a means of transportation. And to outsiders, it seems like it's ridiculous that they're setting up their houses and living in these areas that are prone to flooding, riverbank erosion, in a context that is constantly changing. I just came back from doing some exploratory work during the flood season, something that I'm not able to do on a regular basis, and had the opportunity to talk to people and observe firsthand what life is like during the flood season, right? Where, the fields that I'm used to seeing planted with maize and plantains are all covered in water, where we have to move in canoes to get around communities, and to try to understand the implications for rural livelihoods there and vulnerability in general, thinking of the context of climate change in the Amazon, right? And they're coming in from a drought last year, right? So first a drought, then a flood. And although while I was there, conditions didn't seem to be terribly stressful, even though they were flooded and so on. With time, since my return to Canada, I've learned through conversations with them that water levels that had been, when I was there, higher than they had been 11 years ago in the largest flood in recent memory, have continued to increase. They've been submerged in water for more than 6 weeks now. People have had to leave their houses. Many have had to leave their communities. And there's concerns about, the availability of food, sanitation conditions. The water well is compromised. There's no latrines that are functioning, and what the next year will bring when there has been no assistance from the government. In fact, and considering the issue of invisibility, again, the state has not paid any attention to them. They recognize that there has been an emergency, and a regional state of emergency has been declared, and yet there has been nothing or no attention coming their way. All of the state's attention has been limited to communities and people that are also affected, but that are in urban and peri-urban areas. And the communities that I work in are not even the most remote and isolated communities. I could only imagine what the circumstances might be for people over there, which is really concerning. So again, the issue of invisibility, not only for conservation, but also in terms of disaster management or emergency preparedness, also becomes a big issue. So maybe I will bring us back to the issue of conservation. And traditional resource use practices. The example that I'm going to give is not about rendering them invisible, but maybe when they're vilified and the implications that can have. So I wanted to speak in particular about the practice of traditional Sweden fallow agriculture, sometimes called shifting cultivation, slash and burn agriculture, also in the context in which I do my work. Shifting cultivation has been portrayed for a long period of time, since colonial times, for Asia, for Africa, and even for Latin America. There's been a discourse that has built around the practice being, primitive, being destructive, and also one that is incompatible with the needs to produce food for a growing population in the world. A narrative that, despite many decades elapsing since it first emerged, that continued to come up and used to either criminalize or vilify smallholders in the tropics, in Peru as one example, indigenous peoples, but also these other local groups that don't self-identify as indigenous, right? Some of the arguments that have been mobilized against shifting cultivation and people that practice it are one is the use of fire, that is seen and portrayed as a destructive vegetation management practice. The fact that it's rotational in nature, so it's extensive, right? We require the clearing of, valuable forests that are, the host of, large numbers of species, complex ecosystems, carbon sinks, everything that we deem to be important from a conservation standpoint to produce agriculture, some crops that may not be too productive in terms of yields. But thinking more thoroughly and actually informed by a greater understanding of shifting cultivation as a practice that is very diverse. It's practiced throughout the world, that provides, I think, with some different insights around the practice. So one is that it's widely practiced, particularly throughout the tropics, but it helps to sustain directly or indirectly millions of people globally. So in terms of inclusivity, criminalizing this practice essentially means denying millions of people a way to a livelihood, right? And for many of them, shifting cultivation is also culturally significant or really, really important. Another thing that we often ignore when we vilify shifting cultivation is that contrary to other forms of forest clearing that lead to permanent loss of forest cover, shift in cultivation actually gives rise to forest growth in tropical forests, right? So areas that are originally cleared subsequently grow into forests again. And if we look at them at the landscape level, what is produced is a complex mosaic of forest patches of different ages that add complexity and that enhance or create habitats for large numbers of species, both of plants and animals. And from an agricultural perspective, shifting cultivation may not be terribly productive in terms of agricultural yields, so output per unit of area, but they do provide with substantial amounts of food of different kinds that are more in line with diversity, right? So these are more complex and biodiversity rich agricultural systems that are really important not only for food production, but also for conservation as well. And to provide a bit more context, you see, for the Peruvian government, for example, when thinking about deforestation, the government produced all these maps of forest loss in certain areas, and they actually do not distinguish, changes in land cover between this type of shift in cultivation between colonist agriculture and the large-scale plantations, right? So, which is problematic, right? And then also, last summer during the intense period of droughts, which led to immense areas of forest lost to fires, that people in the capital city and in the press were actually blaming small-scale farmers and indigenous communities for their practices as the main cause for these fires, again, without distinguishing that there's many other actors and factors involved in the incidents of fires last summer, but it could have been any other year. This is not exclusive to Peru. This is something that is widespread. Similar cases are seen in Madagascar, in the Philippines, and Brazil even, and in many other places. So it can be dangerous when indigenous peoples and local communities and their practices are either ignored or invisible or vilified as something different from what we would want or expect.
Next, we spoke with Asana Farshchi, whose research explores how participatory mapping with local communities can influence more just, grounded environmental planning. It's great to have you on our podcast, Asana.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be asked to speak to this podcast, and thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Asana. I'm currently actually doing my second year of my master's in environment and sustainability at the University of Toronto School of Environment at St. George campus. But my undergrad was in urban planning and design from the University of Tehran. Currently, my thesis work focuses more on participatory mapping and environmental justice. And I've been especially interested in seeing how community-led efforts can kind of shift the way we approach conservation and environmental planning, or more broader urban planning as well. So for my thesis, I've been working with the community members in the city of Peterborough to map out the environmental elements of environmental harms and benefits they encounter in their daily lives. Things like pollution, access to green space, sources of clean water, or even more social aspect, sources of joy, areas of concern, places for community gatherings, and stuff like this. So we use participatory tools like Google Earth in community workshops, which allowed people to kind of add their own observation and perceptions about environmental matters into the work.
That's fascinating. Based on your experience, what does equitable and inclusive conservation mean to you?
To me, personally, equitable and inclusive environmental planning, urban planning, or conservation means to recognize that nature isn't separate from people and that decisions about the environment need to be made with, by, and for the communities who live with it every day. It's actually about more than just representation. It's about the power dynamic, who gets to decide what's worth protecting or whose knowledge is valued and whose priorities shape the outcome, the final outcome. But unfortunately, historically, conservation has excluded those most impacted, especially indigenous communities, racialized groups, and working class peoples. And also Western conservation specifically kind of models, it assumes a nature and a natural and scientific approach, but in practice, they kind of reflect very specific worldviews and kind of doesn't consider the indigenous and lived experiences. Most of the time, they treat the land as empty and a place that need to be preserved, which can kind of lead to displacement and erasure at the long term. But versus equitable conservation here asks us to confront that legacy and kind of shift our focus toward a more just process. It kind of honors the indigenous sovereignty, supporting the local leadership and valuing traditional and lived knowledge alongside the scientific data, government data, and all the technical professional aspects of each project that we are running. Yeah, being that said, in my own work, being part of that process kind of made me reflect on how conservation, environmental planning isn't just about saving the nature, saving the environment. It's more so deeply connected to people, to relationships, and their memories, their feeling, their emotions, and justice generally.
You mentioned challenges and power dynamics. Could you share more about the benefits and barriers to inclusive conservation?
Well, about bringing the diverse voices into the conservation planning, well, of course, there are like many benefits about, but one is that communities often have like this deep and place-based knowledge that's kind of developed over the generations. They have this very rich understanding of the seasonal cycles, how they work, the ecological changes, and the subtle patterns about their own environment and natural spaces that necessarily can't be captured with the data alone. So in my own research, community members, for example, often pointed out places of emotional and cultural significance, spots where, for example, they could walk their dogs in like peaceful environments, or where the kids could play without like being worried about like any concerns, or the places they've witnessed the environmental degradation firsthand and how they made them feel particularly. So these insights help paint a richer and more human picture of the landscape and its challenges. But another possible benefit is that when people are genuinely involved in the process itself, they are kind of more likely to support and sustain the conservation efforts over the time, which kind of creates like this sense of ownership and care and a sense of community. That said, there are also challenges associated with that as well, of course. One major challenge that I can point it out is tokenism, for example, is a big one where communities are asked to participate, but actually we see that decisions have already been made. So this makes the feeling of distrust over the time in communities, specifically in those communities that have been historically excluded or harmed by environmental policies and have this in their history. And also there is institutional resistance, of course, but conservation agencies and governments, which mostly rely on rigid frameworks and timelines and funding structures that kind of don't leave any room for a deep relationship building, co-learning, or co-production of knowledge and or shared governance that we want to seek during these processes.
You're working on a participatory mapping project in Peterborough. Can you walk us through how you've integrated local voices into your research?
Yeah, so for this, I'm gonna talk a little bit more in detail about my current master thesis project. My work is actually part of this bigger study that aims to study the environmental harms and benefits and environmental justice happening in Peterborough, as I mentioned earlier. I use the participatory GIS or public participation GIS as a strategy and method to doing that, which I can mention that as a practical strategy in doing these community involved works. So the way we approached it, we held 5 community workshops, and the first one was introductory workshop, orientation, more so like orientation workshop, and then there was like 4 seasonal workshops, each with about like 25 community members. We asked them to map out both their environmental harms and benefits in their own perception and perspective, like anything that they see in their daily lives that they think and resonate with it as an environmental element. And we didn't just collect these pins on a map. We held these community workshops, and then we are going to publish the result of this research and analysis we did afterwards in a publicly accessible website. But then I guess the real challenge comes in place to in no ways to we ensure that these are actually going to be heard in some place and make some difference in some place, because most of our participants during these workshops pointed out that they want to see their opinion taking into account and makes some kind of changes. So making sure that these data are available and these works are being done kind of is a good way to provide another way of thinking and another way of doing these kind of research towards environmental planning, conservations, urban planning in general. And it can kind of triggers the decision-making bodies, governmental policymakers to take into account these not often heard voices into their policymaking and decision-making processes.
One final question. How do community members express their feelings about these issues? Do you encounter anger, frustration, or hope?
That's a really good question, actually. In our workshop, there was kind of this negative perspective towards the government. They thought the city is not actually taking their responsibility seriously towards the citizens and community. And they had a lot of like critical thoughts and aspects about like criticizing the work of the municipality, the city per se. And they were suggesting the possible other ways that they can tackle a couple of problems. And they were specifically mentioning that if the city listens to the people, to the community, they can make a better decisions. I mean, I've heard this multiple times in our workshops. So people are keen to participate in the decision making about their environment because this is the place that they are living in, and of course it matters to them. But it's a matter of fact that is there a place for them to do it, and are they valued, and are their opinion going to be valued, and is like the government going to hear the people's voice in any way in any project in the future or not. But they are keen to participate, and they would actually love to have their voice heard, but there's unfortunately haven't been opportunity up until now.
Thank you very much, Asana, for sharing your experience with us. It was such a great conversation. Now we're going to talk with Maggie Chang, who is an environmentalist, an artist, a storyteller, and a co-founder of Uptown Climate Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us. Could you please share a bit about your background in the environmental field?
Sure. So my name is Maggie Chang, and I've kind of been an environmentalist my entire life. I got really mad when I heard about deforestation in the Amazon in like first grade and kind of kept with it ever since. So I went to the University of Waterloo for Environment, Resources, and Sustainability. And in that time, I completed a thesis around sort of the barriers and opportunities that racialized youth experience in accessing and continuing in the environmental field. So definitely like a huge passion of mine, environment and equity. So that's why I'm here.
What was it like, the process of forming your thesis and creating and producing that?
It was a really interesting process. I actually started because I was really feeling this urgency that environmental action was too slow, and I just wanted to understand more about what actually makes people act, you know? And
Right.
my thesis supervisor was like, that's great, but you have 8 months to do this. That's a very big question. Why don't you narrow it down a little bit somehow? So I basically started like thinking a little bit, and I'd become very passionate about sort of like equity issues in high school. And it was through like my first couple of years at Waterloo that I learned about issues like environmental racism, which like combined my passions for environment and equity. So that was very interesting. So then at that point, I started kind of like thinking about, oh, maybe I can do that as well to narrow the thesis. And I was thinking about things like in my high school eco team, for example, and I went to a predominantly white high school, which was maybe like 80% white, but we actually had an overrepresentation of particularly East and South Asian people in eco team. And then I go to my environmental like university program, and it's more or less like a flip of that, if that, and all of the
Really?
faculty is white. Yeah. And so I just wanted to really get a better understanding of why that might be happening. And so that's how I landed on my thesis topic.
All right. Wow, that's very insightful. I would like to jump into our first question. What does inclusive and equitable conservation mean to you?
So, to me, inclusive and equitable conservation is really making sure that everybody who is, interested and passionate or just wants to be part of it is able to their full capacity and reach their full potential. And I think there's a lot to say too about how particularly Western scientific or Eurocentric scientific methods have been taking people out of the equation when it comes to like environment and conservation. And I think there's a lot of need to really consider how people and the environment work together in order to have sort of equitable and inclusive conservation. Because we have a history, right, in the conservation field of kicking indigenous peoples off their land to quote unquote protect nature. And that's a problem that's inequitable, and the field really needs to, atone for these horrible things that they did.
Absolutely. I completely agree. What do you believe are some of the main challenges to achieving this conservation? And what are your thoughts on how we might address some of these challenges?
I think so. One of the things that I wrote about in my thesis was that the environmental field kind of sits at the intersection of two fields that have historically and, because of that history, continue to have problematic attitudes toward women and racial minorities and probably other marginalized identities. And by that, I mean sort of the environment and conservation field has been pretty discriminatory, as well as sort of like the science side or science kind of field. And so I found studies that were like pretty recent, around like maybe 2019, 2020, where people were being interviewed and they were continuing to hear attitudes from like supervisors and so about like assumptions that like women cannot be leaders in conservation. And some of the barriers that I found in my thesis, and I did focus on race, but I tried to make it like as intersectional as I could. And I allowed people to talk about how their various identities might have impacted their experiences, or how they might have impacted how their other identities might have worked in conjunction with race to create their experiences. And so some of the things that people talked about were around like not having mentors who kind of like look like them or might have a similar experience to them. And that can be a really big barrier, because another component of that is that you don't feel necessarily safe that people like you can succeed in the field, and that people like you don't have a roadmap of what to even do to be successful in the field. And so basically one of the things that I wrote about was that it's like it's not necessarily like this history of racism that's being a direct barrier to people, but because of the legacy of this history of racism, like excluding particularly women and racialized people out of the field, that we're seeing indirect barriers around people, feeling like they can be in the field. So I think those are really big ones.
completely agree with all of the points that you've shared. Actually, I had a bit of a follow-up question that I was really curious about. So environmental work tends to be, like you said, standardized within scientific and empirical practices, but there are countless practices that influence conservation efforts and create meaningful impacts, especially those within fine arts humanities. The arts speak volumes across boundaries, across minds, and communicate so many different powerful and meaningful stories. Could you speak to how your poetry and creative work and the intersectional lenses that you've applied so far have contributed to your efforts in climate activism and for your narrative?
Sure. So I love this question because I'm so passionate about it. I like really truly believe that arts are going to be central to reimagining and helping us reach that sustainable future that we all want. There's this Maya Angelou quote that goes something like, people will forget what you say and do, but they'll never forget how they make you feel. And so that's what art does. It really evokes emotion and it stays with them. Your message, your work, whatever, when you inspire people in a way that connects to them emotionally, that's going to stay with them and potentially be that lever to get people to act. So in terms of stuff that I've done, there's like this continuation story into the arts of my thesis,
Uh-huh.
which was one of the things that I was thinking about even toward the end of doing that research, was that this is so interesting. I've heard such interesting, fantastic stories from people, just about their experiences. And one of the things that I ran into was because a lot of racialized young people in Canada are from a first or second generation immigration. They have stories of quote unquote back home or like their families overseas that
Mhm.
have impacted their environmental journeys. And that's never something that we talk about or hear about when we talk about sort of the environment or conservation field in Canada. And I just really wanted to have a way to share these kinds of stories with a wider audience and just not have this thesis just like sit and gather dust in like an ivory tower kind of thing.
So what was that experience like then? I guess like sharing your thesis forward, how did that look for you?
So what I ended up doing was I kind of always had a bit of a dream after that about wanting to turn the thesis, if you will, into some sort of art installation
Mhm.
where I would like hire artists maybe to like read parts of it and do an artistic interpretation of something or another. What I ended up doing is that I joined the React, Recreate, and Revision residency, which was
Mhm.
around sort of arts for social change. Due to like time restraints, funding restraints, I ended up doing the whole project as the main artist. And so I did kind of a bit of a follow up on my thesis in that I interviewed racialized youth environmentalists about their reflections around land, nature, and migration.
Great.
And then I did portraits of them because one of the barriers that I uncovered in my thesis was that like a lack of self-representation or like lack of seeing people who looked like you succeeding in the field was a barrier that people were running into, right?
Mhm.
So then I was like, okay, if I do this portrait series that's directly going to contribute to improving the self-representation that people can have. And so this portrait series became part of this cool art show. It's called Trajectories of Now, and it was shown alongside the other great work that people were doing. And something that was really meaningful to me was that like people told me months afterward that exactly what I was talking about, that art was inspiring and art stuck with them. People said things like, like I don't fully remember like all of the details of the event, but I remember how the participants in your portraits, I remember how they looked at me. And so it makes me think more about like the racialized youth environmental and climate action and efforts. And that means a lot to me because it's really, really hard to be a youth climate activist. We receive like
True.
less than 1% of funding for all environmental stuff.
That's really beautiful that you translated that into such a beautiful representative art form. Oh
Thank
my
you.
God.
Do you have any plans in the near future or possibly beyond to do another art series like that, whether it's like written or visual? What are you hoping to do next with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of always on the back burner, what was tabled was I started, looking into various arts grants opportunities for expansion of the series.
Mhm.
So, I interviewed and I did portraits of six racialized youth environmentalists, most of whom were people that I like personally knew. And that was awesome. But it would be really cool if we could expand that to 12, or I chose sort of one photo from the photo shoot to show. It could be cool to have a few kind
Mhm.
of blown up and then shown in another gallery space for people. I also started this group called or I co-founded this group called Uptown Climate Conversations,
Mhm.
which is bringing conversational and collective visioning sustainability events to North York because it's an underserved region of the Greater Toronto Area in terms of sustainability gathering spaces. And one of the things that we're really interested in and we focus on a lot is leaning into arts and creativity to help envision a better future and help, yeah, just like gather our experiences and use that creativity to generate what that more sustainable future that works for all of us and what that looks like.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and all of the work you've accomplished with us today. A follow-up question, and the final one that I have for you is, with the guide of intersectional lenses, how are you witnessing across the environmental sector and social and eco-justice initiatives the decentralization of empirical science and the growing shift towards including interdisciplinary voices and backgrounds into environmental spaces?
The first thing that kind of comes to mind is that I think depending on how, like, where you're looking at it from, there's definitely lots of efforts that are out there that kind of just need that support to sort of scale up. Like grassroots community has always been there and they've always been doing stuff. And I think where some of the issue or the problem that we've been running into is that there's a lack of balance, if you will. Like the um, empirical, quote unquote, scientific approach has been overly emphasized and overly assumed to be the only one that's valid and overly held up as the one and only truth when we know that's not true. And so for me, I think what it really is that in some ways like grassroots communities can really benefit from using scientific methods. For example, something that we're doing is we're trying to collect data about like the demographics. Something that we're doing at Uptown Climate Conversations is that we're trying to collect data around like who we're serving and how we're impacting them, and just having both quantitative and qualitative data that we
Mhm.
can then back ourselves up with or use in various different ways. And then I think on the flip side, what sort of more academic or scientific communities need to be doing is building trust and really getting involved in the community as well, because like yeah, there's reasons and good reasons for the ways that all both sides kind of approach it. And one of the things that the scientific or academic community can do is help legitimize the work of grassroots community to people who might not have otherwise really taken it seriously or something like that. And so I think it's really just about like balance and making sure to like take the good parts from all of the things that we're learning from and amplifying those without only saying one way or the other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anything that we didn't discuss today that you would like to share at all?
Sure. So
Mhm.
I think on the question list, there was something about like integrating Indigenous and local community voices into conservation planning.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to talk about around that is this concept that I learned about like in the last year or two, and it's called biocultural diversity. There's this organization called Terra Lingua Landscapes that really I believe coined it and like does a lot of good work around promoting it. But it's basically this idea that like biodiversity, we shouldn't just consider it in the ecological sense, but we should
Mhm.
consider all of the different cultures of people and sort of integrate that in the ecological biodiversity. So we're thinking about diversity in terms of like all of the human and non-human worlds together. And I think that concept is very powerful because it does empower a lot of, indigenous and local communities in terms of recognizing that their way of life is legitimate, and it helps explain why it's not appropriate to kick them off their land to quote unquote protect nature, because they're part of it too. And it also considers how the diversity of cultures is how we're like stewarding biodiversity in the ecological sense very well, and how we need to like really appreciate and take care of the cultures that are taking care of the environment so that all together we can thrive. And
Mhm.
so I just wanted to point out this concept and this idea and the work of this really great organization, because I think it's a really important framework for us to move forward.
Last but not least, we spoke with Professor Thomas Hummel from the Honors College at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I'm thrilled to participate, actually. I am Thomas Hummel. I teach in the Honors College at Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. And I have an incredibly varied background. My graduate degree is in creative writing, and professionally, I've spent a lot of time working in child and adolescent social work. I was also taught middle school special education for students with emotional disabilities. And now I teach in the Honors College at Western, and there's a surprising amount of overlap between those positions, I think. But I guess the shorter answer is that despite the shifting of location and subject, I've been an educator for most of my professional life.
Why should equitable and inclusive considerations be an inherent aspect of conversations?
I don't see a way in which one can have conversations without equitable and inclusive considerations. Any attempt to undertake a conversation, however abstract, either at the interpersonal level or at the institutional level, I think conversation begins with equitable and inclusive consideration. And so I think, depending on the setting, that's a prerequisite for having any conversation that would, again, incorporate equitable practices. I think there needs to be preceded by a collective definition of what that looks like how the needs are being met, rather than just ascribing to the broad idea of equity with a capital E. I think the point at which we think of equity or inclusivity as being accomplished states is the point at which they begin to deteriorate. And this is a conversation I have with students a lot, because I think it's at that point when the way that we think and talk about equity as a stable and solidified state, there is some locus of power that has the ability to make something equitable or to take it away. If I were to ask someone, okay, well, how does one go about the process of making an institution or a classroom inclusive? But that retention of power makes me question the extent to which something is equitable, right? If someone does have the power to make something inclusive or to make something equitable, then they just as easily have the same power to take it away.
Would you please speak to the acts of space? What can we learn from engaging with different perspectives, ways of thinking, and operating in lenses that we might be uncomfortable with?
I can't possibly conceive of a situation in which I would think of learning as anything other than engaging with different perspectives or ways of thinking or operating in lenses that I might be uncomfortable with. Like, I can't imagine learning being anything other than that. I mean, those seem to me to be the very basic building blocks of what constitutes the pursuit of the new. I'm very curious about the act of space. Do you think of space as being an agentive thing? Like that space retains the ability to act, or that there are actions endemic to space in and of itself?
I think that's a really good question, actually. Like, agencies of space, a lot of different conversations that can happen across a lot of different spaces based on the bodies that are within the space, whether that is like a physical body or I want to say body as concept. Based on the different perspectives that then enter a room, there can be opportunity to bring in different bodies into those spaces, perpetually recreate the spaces that we are inhabiting, and can be flexible as long as we're open to opportunity to adapt.
So we are in complete agreement. And I love the idea of the body as an agent of space because I couldn't agree more. One of the very first conversations that we have is about the extent they see themselves and the spaces they inhabit as in a constant state of becoming. It becomes room by virtue of the person's presence and the presence of the people who are alongside them. We are, in fact, process, and we are in a constant state of exchange and transformation with one another, with the spaces that we inhabit, the spaces that we create. If we approach it as it's not unlike what we were saying about the reaching this theoretically like achieved state of equity, I think it's equally problematic to conceptualize ourselves as inhabiting any space as opposed to being in the creation of it at all times.
On similar lines, but more tailored to the conservation aspect, what are your thoughts on the roles of traditional and local knowledges, as well as the notions of community-based collaboration and their importance for conservation management and discourse?
It's hard for me to conceptualize there being a discrete line between the ideas of traditional and local knowledges. One of the things that came up a lot in my course that I was teaching this quarter was the extent to which we, as people who inhabit various communities, are, rather than being a site of a centralized selfhood that will always be there at our center, that instead trying to wrap our heads around ourselves as ultimately just the accumulated care and attention and perception and views of everyone that we encounter and everyone who has come before us. And in conversation with a student, she referred to that process as collage. Often we think about this at the level of accumulation, of just being this amassed information of the past from our parents, from their parents, right? Generational sort of accumulation of self. But to refer to that process as collage is very different than accumulation because collage is curated. It is ultimately evaluative. It's mobilizing our pasts and potential presents and futures and taking ownership over how we are the carriers of that information and how it is we, rather than accumulate, we're creating that past just as much as we are creating the present and the future that we live into. And I'm mentioning this because it speaks to the difficulty I have in establishing a difference between traditional and local knowledge. I don't think you can have either without, I think they're the same thing. The line that we establish between them, aside from the level of nomenclature, is purely institutional, not unlike academic disciplines in the way that we think about them, right? All of the disciplines that we respectively inhabit are interdependent. None of them exist on their own and can't, and we wouldn't want them to, but just for the pure creation of the institutions that we populate, we require these kind of discrete separations of things. And so I think fundamentally, the difference between traditional and local knowledge is purely linguistic. I don't think in practice there is any difference. To shift it to conservation, the second half of your question focuses on community-based collaboration. And just as it's difficult for me to establish any sort of difference between traditional and local knowledge, I would say that the use of community in the singular is equally problematic, right? For me, and you didn't do this, but I'm just for the sake of clarity.
Yep.
I think the point at which we think about community as being a singular entity is the point at which we lose a lot of potential forms of creation. I think a community is constantly becoming and is constantly many. In both parts of this question, whether at the level of the becoming of community or about the extent to which we are agents of collage, not accumulation, those two things come to pass at the level of conservation, and not trying to approach conservation efforts from a vantage of restoration in and of itself, but to treat conservation as a kind of becoming also. I think the lasting damage that we collectively have inflicted upon the environment more broadly, lasting damage that we have brought to bear means that there is no restoration to be had. We can stem the tide, so to speak, but we are becoming a new world at all times. Problematically in our current moment, but I do think that at the level of conservation, what we are saving, what we are conserving is future. I don't think that we're conserving past or bringing the world that we inhabit back to a prior state. I don't think that that's possible. And I think the extent to which we funnel resources toward that is problematic in a lot of ways, not least of all because I think that's taking the accumulative approach as opposed to the approach of collage. If we are to conserve at the level of futurity, to imagine potential futures, I think conversation has to begin with the moment of right now, this moment and the next. I think we conserve by making from where we are as opposed to looking backward.
Yes. And that's something that I feel like myself and also a lot of different people are trying to navigate in the conservation and environmental sector. My follow-up question to that is understanding that notion, how do we come up with tangible ways to communicate that and like getting that institutional like recognized and understood?
It's a great question, and one that assuredly has more answers than either of us can attempt, right? But a lot of ways, the way that that's translated is through other forms of change. I remember pretty early on in my academic development, I encountered, well, through pursuing American literature, I began grappling with the way in which we conceptualize wilderness as being something that is without human involvement and how impossible that is, right? I mean, the notion that there's something that is without us is so far from being. I think the responsibility of translation falls on other disciplines. It falls in other conversations. It falls on other institutions, because I think it isn't just a byproduct of a specific kind of practice or a specific kind of education. I think that by adhering to inherited forms of practice, I think in a professional sense, I don't have an answer as to how that gets translated, because I think in terms of what it looks like in the field, I think that it's so much depends upon the funding and institutional support and sustainable practices in ways that require a kind of management from without, right? I mean, I think that all of these things have institutional complexities that go far beyond the conceptual achievement of difference at the level of practice. I'm going to bring it back to what I do know, which is the classroom as a creative space. And bird's eye view of the courses that I mentioned earlier that I teach to the first year students. There are classes in which we read books and then we talk about them. One of the challenges I have in these classes is conveying to the students that the books are purely raw material. They are simply the tools through which we actualize different manifestations of ourselves. And these are classes predicated upon practice. And those practices, I think, extend from situations in which we bring to bear concepts of ecology. Ultimately, the classes that I inhabit are ecologies of practice, but it's a willingness to cross the disciplinary divide and to find different ways of conceptualizing, to re-understand training, to untrain myself in various ways, to provide opportunities for students to understand possibility in a new way. And I think seeking those opportunities and unmaking the spaces that we regularly find ourselves in, that's how, on a broader sense, we can begin to translate the kind of change that you're talking about. I don't think it begins in conservation. I don't think it begins in any particular discipline. I think it's internalizing the processes of becoming that we've been talking about at every step of the way, whether it's the perpetual reaching toward equitability and inclusivity, or whether it's mobilization of difference being the sort of cornerstone of any conversation, and thinking of communities as many and not one, actively taking steps to undo, even in however small a way, the practices that reinforce those positions. I think that's how we translate these concepts into change. I don't think it's on the responsibility of any one person or any institution. I think that it begins in the minor gestures that we make on a daily basis.
Absolutely. That was incredible. Thank you so much. What are your thoughts on the representations of community-based work, thought processes, and collaboration?
I have so many thoughts. They're present every day, anytime I enter a classroom. But I found myself trying to frame a class that I am teaching in the forthcoming spring quarter. And the class itself is focused on place. And the questions that I'm asking the students are like, how are we the place that we make? And how are the places that we make, in fact, us also? And in an effort to explain this preface of sorts, I struggled. I kept starting again and again. And this kind of struggle is like a little bit unfamiliar to me, but I knew what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to say. I knew how I wanted to frame the class to them. And for whatever reason, I falling short, like everything seemed a little bit off. When I stepped away, I was reminded of a moment in the first season of Mr. Rogers that said everything I want to say. So there's a knock on the door, and Mr. Rogers goes and answers the door, and it's Chef Brockett who is there, and he's there purely to ask for help and to share his work with Mr. Rogers. And he has a list of all the things he needs to make a cake for King Friday, who is someone that Mr. Rogers will never meet, who lives in a place Mr. Rogers can never go to. And yet, of course, they're going to work together. Mr. Rogers invites him in. He's thrilled by the prospect of working with him. And just by looking at the way that they engage with one another, it's so clear that they want nothing more than to just make something. But then what we find out is that for whatever reason, Chef Brockett doesn't like to speak while he's baking. He was speaking at the door, he was speaking in the living room, but he has a rule that there's no talking while cooking. He doesn't explain it. Mr. Rogers doesn't ask why. They just go about the process of baking silently. And they go through this whole process. And Mr. Rogers says to no one, essentially, to the room, he says, I know people now who, when they go into their own kitchen, they say, shh. And in that moment, that says everything about community-based collaboration to me. Like the sheer prospect of working together in a kind of celebration or toward some form of becoming that's going to be given away and learning something new. And just the sheer possibility of embracing something that is so important to somebody else that it becomes important to him too is everything. And the thing that, I mean, I'm tearing up now in the same way that I did the first time I saw this, because what he says is, I know people now who go into their own kitchen, which is to say that the sheer fact of working together, of the possibility and the gift of it, means that the kitchen is just as much Chef Brockett's as it is Mr. Rogers. And that there can't be a kitchen anymore without Mr. Rogers, in the same way that there can't be a classroom without the students that have come before. It's just we're choosing what to mobilize. But in order to do that, we have to be willing to accept the limits of others. We have to be willing, just for the sheer sake of possible change, of adapting without explanation to the needs of the people around us. And I think an unwillingness to do that is at the heart of where collaboration breaks down. And I guess I want to be able to find a way to know people now who go into their kitchen and say, shh.
This brings us to the end of our guest speakers' conversations, and thanks again to all of our speakers for joining us today. I think it would be a great place for myself and my co-producers, Gigi and Dina, to reflect a bit on what we have just talked about with our guests. These conversations have been so inspirational and bring a lot of thoughtful considerations to our discussion. For our closing reflections, what stood out to the both of you throughout our podcast?
Thank you, Sam. I think I'll jump in. And what really stood out to me is how Maggie was talking that we are really taking a Western approach in terms of how we approach conservation issues these days. And she was even talking about the legacy of discrimination, which I find pretty interesting, given that this field is quite new. It all started like in the 70s, and the fact that there's still ongoing racism, sexism, and the fact that we are not able to overcome that. I think like some of the points that she was making were really powerful. And in the conservation field in particular, we're talking about the diversity, but there is a really interesting term that she mentioned, which is the biocultural diversity. We're talking a lot about like how we need to protect all the species to be able to maintain the balance and to let all the ecosystems work properly, but we often forget to mention all those people and all those cultures that are actually taking care of the environment, of the nature around us. And I think that's biocultural diversity term reflects many important points. So another point that Maggie brought up and really resonated with me was how she was talking that people don't often feel safe when there's no one who looks like them, who is relatable. And that speaks a lot to me because as a woman, as a racialized woman, I felt that a lot throughout my life, not only in work, but also like in life in general. And I think it's really powerful what Maggie is doing in her work of how she's trying to make people feel heard, feel seen through her art. And I found that really inspiring because like in my own work, I've been trying to engage as many young people as possible in this field, and it's often quite challenging, especially in the Central Asian region from where I'm coming from, because people often don't even perceive this as a real field, as a career opportunity. And also, as I said, like it's often really challenging for people when they cannot even relate to anyone in the field. So I think that what she's doing with her art can actually inspire so many people, so many young people out there who might actually see someone who looks similar to them, who they relate to, and who are doing like all this brilliant work to protect the nature. I find it really beautiful how she's able to connect art and this cause of protecting nature, but at the same time raising all the intersectional issues such as like racism, sexism. So we could overcome this legacy of discrimination in the field and hopefully to achieve biocultural diversity and protect the planet. So I think that's it's just really powerful and inspiring.
Thank you, Dina, so much. I also really feel grateful with all our speakers who shared such incredible insights that really resonated with me. And I feel like you quite well covered these like local level issues and individual action as like the key topics. And we also kind of like covered some of the big picture questions, which speaking of those questions, what really spoke to me personally was when Professor Abizaid said that we must all ask first, what exactly are we conserving? Second, who gets to decide that? And for whom do we make these decisions? And what really made me sad is that, you know, these indigenous and local communities are usually the most affected by environmental issues and the decisions that we make. And at the same time, their knowledge on how to fix these issues just remains ignored, and their traditional knowledge sometimes gets misunderstood. So just to remember what Professor Abizaid said, we have on one side, there are these issues of dismissing traditional practices or even criminalizing them. And then on the other side, we also have issues of romanticizing indigenous peoples, which can, as you can imagine, can bring these unrealistic expectations on how it is their role to save us in front of all these environmental challenges. And I may digress, but what really also spoke to me that kind of relates to this topic is a few days ago, I came across this LinkedIn post from a group called Possible Futures Decolonial Collective. And I didn't know about them before, but I looked them up and they were a global South-based collective that aims to decolonize sustainability movement, which is kind of interesting. But what they said in that post kind of shook me. And it said that using indigenous knowledge to fix capitalist problems, and especially without consent, is just another form of colonialism and knowledge appropriation. And this kind of hit me hard because I guess all of us can relate that throughout our studies, we usually thought that bringing indigenous knowledge into environmental decisions is always just inherently good. It cannot be bad. But I really see now how it's much more complicated, which ties also what Asana said about the power and the divisions of power. And so the key idea that any decision making, and even outside of the area of conservation, is just shaped by whoever is holding the pen and making those decisions. And when participation by local indigenous communities are just surface level, it's when the folks in a room are just talking and nothing really happens. And that's just tokenism, what Asana was talking about. So all these conversations, I think what they did is they really reshaped how I think about conservation. I think it's not just about whether we include these ways of knowing, but also how we include them. Is it with respect? Is it with consent? Help share power? Do we don't help share power? And finally, I think the key point that all speakers brought up was the power of meaningful relationships that can really solve a lot of the issues we have today. And not just relationships with each other, but also with our land, with our culture. And so to me, that importance of listening, like learning from others and sharing our power stood out as, the three ingredients to like this recipe of inclusive and equitable conservation, which I guess we all know it sounds so simple and yet also so hard to achieve.
Thank you, Gigi, so much for providing your perspectives on our conversation. They were incredibly insightful, and I really appreciate the different pieces that you've brought into our conversation. Going back to some of Asana's work, what I truly appreciated about her conversation is how she focused on one of the quotes that I picked up was that decisions are made with, by, and for the communities every day. And I think that's an incredibly important aspect we need to remember just across all of environmental sectors in policymaking, advocacy, decisions, and science itself, that the work that we're doing, it spans across so many kinds of perspectives. It's not just for the benefit of institutional practices, as it's been standardized to believe in the past, but it is truly for our communities and how that's tailored to the conversations that are happening locally and the different impacts that have been harbored across like marginalized and racialized communities that are facing all these impacts of climate change, and then any sort of, I guess, like top-down approaches that are happening from institution down to communities. So what I appreciated as well with Asana's conversation is her bringing up how this work needs to go beyond representation and that decisions need to be made with intent and incorporating the best scientific practices that are going to be truly of benefit to the communities that these practices are for, and the reprioritization of institutional power that would then aim to balance community perspectives into these local decisions that are being made, and the prioritization of uplifting and diversifying these voices, increasing trust in public participation, and just really ensuring that community voices are being heard, implemented into decisions, and reprioritizing how we're having these conversations and what these tangible solutions and outlooks are looking like. And not that it's just like a byproduct of institutional concern, but more like coming down to our local community levels. How are we ensuring these voices are being heard and uplifted? And on a similar line from Professor Hummel's conversation, I greatly appreciated his conversations on how ecosystems and just concerns with the environment need to be constantly in the works, constantly like re-looked at, refocused on, and discussed from multiple different angles, and what we should aiming towards conservation of futures. And aiming towards more reconciliations for past harms on impacted communities, and how we can uplift and support every voice through the unmaking of spaces that we exist in, and needing to create tangible ways to understand how all of these different practices are interdependent
interdependent of one another, and how we can create solutions that are not in any way exclusive as they have been historically and currently are still practiced, but actively working to include these voices and ideas that we should be engaging with to create and promote new ways for devising solutions. And rather than just quantification and that being our standard approach to implementing solution, we need to incorporate all quantitative and qualitative aspects in a very meaningful manner to approach all of the local situations that are occurring, making sure everyone's voices are heard and respected and incorporated.
Before we end our podcast, I think there are some other questions that these reflections may have raised. Like for me personally, I'm thinking how we can actually ensure that we include these indigenous and local community voices in a way that it doesn't become a form of appropriation or tokenism. And when we do that, how do we truly share the power, considering all the conflicting interests and uneven distribution of resources as well? And I wonder, do you guys also have any questions that you'd like to leave our listeners to think about?
Thank you, Gigi. I actually had a somewhat similar question because I was wondering how we can continue to learn from indigenous and local communities, but at the same time not take advantage of that and not try to appropriate their experience, their knowledge, because I think it's important for us to build mutually beneficial relationship, but I was wondering like how we can make that happen.
Thank you, Gigi and Dina, for sharing your questions and perspectives. The question I'd like to leave us here with is, for conserving and supporting our futures, how will we take responsibility to create tangible solutions and possibilities that are equitable to each perspective that is brought into environmental considerations and conversations? And as well, how will we advocate and promote meaningful discourse in the conservation sphere? All right, that's a great place to end here. Special thanks to all of our speakers for being a part of this conversation and joining us on our podcast. And thank you all for listening to Diversity Defended.